Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another event of the Arts and Culture Lecture Series organized by the Yunus Emre Institute, London. So today, we are going to discuss the Netflix ecosystem, a focus on Turkish series. And we have as guest speaker, Orçun Can. He is a writer, filmmaker, and a PhD candidate at King's College London, Department of Culture, Media and Creative Industries. Orçun researches Netflix originals narrative forms. He aims to map out different narrative possibilities that the subscription video on demand platform facilitates. Additionally, he teaches creative industries at the University of Bedfordshire, and he also leads seminars for various modules at King's College London. Welcome, Orçun.
Hi, Carla.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. You?
Not too bad. A bit of rainy weather in London.
It is.
Otherwise, it's fine.
Before we start, if you don't mind, Orçun, I'm just going to give a little bit of an introduction to the topic for today, and then we can then move on to your talk, and later on we will have opportunity for a lengthy discussion, and everyone attending this talk will be able to ask questions, and we will do our best to try to cover all the questions. So a little bit about today's event. So Turkish television dramas, dizies, have grown exponentially in international popularity in the last decade. Today, the Turkish television market is the second biggest exporter of content after US television. In the last few years, Netflix has shown interest in Turkish series, ordering their first ever original production from the country, The Protector in 2018, followed by The Gift in 2019 and Love 101 in 2020. Prior to the global pandemic, they had announced 6 new shows that were simultaneously under development. And I believe today the first ever Turkish Netflix original film, One Way to Tomorrow, is being released on Netflix. So while the growing popularity of Turkish TV in the world is on the rise, at the same time we have the catalog of Turkish TV on Netflix also ever expanding. In that sense, it seems very timely to take a snapshot of the Netflix ecosystem and explore where does the Turkish content fit in. So thank you, Orçun, for giving us opportunity to find out a little bit more about Netflix and Turkish series.
Oh, thank you so much for facilitating this. And thank you so much for the introduction as well. And also thanks to everyone who has come to watch us talk. And again, thanks to Yunus Emre Institute for giving us a space to do this. As Carla introduced, we're going to be talking about the Netflix ecosystem, and more specifically, where does Turkish content fit in it? Which might, for some of you, it might seem like a sort of out of the water sort of topic. For some else of you, well, isn't that about time already? So I just want to not give us sort of a presentation or a talk, but give a larger introduction into why this matters right now. Why should we be talking about Turkish television, and why should we be talking about Turkish television in Netflix? And it all starts with a very simple question, which is, what is a dizi? This is a term that you might have come across on Netflix or in any other streaming platforms, or you might actually know it if you have watched a couple of Turkish series. There is a specific type of Turkish programming called a dizi, which as a word is the literal translation of series to Turkish, but as a genre, it is something unique to its own. It is not really a series, it is not a soap opera, it is not a telenovela, but it's a drama, and it is a soap opera, and it is a telenovela, and it is many more things too. And most of the Turkish TV that we see right now globally falls into that category of a dizzy. So let's just sort of start with trying to characterize this dizzy at least a little bit. One thing, so their first quality is dizzies are always long. So you never have something called a half-hour dizzy. You don't have it. You don't have the 22-minute haha sitcom-like dizzy. A dizzy will be long. It will usually be longer than 2 hours or at least 90 minutes without any commercial breaks. But in its actual broadcast slot, with commercial breaks, with recaps, with everything, it can actually go up to 4 hours. So it might even be your whole evening, your whole night. So that is a very important characteristic that really determines what disease are. Secondly, disease will, not all of them, but they will predominantly have family in their center. So you never get those lone wolf stories in disease. There is always a family, or even if there is a lone wolf, you see that lone wolf in the context of a family, or trying to get inside a family, or trying to reconnect with a family. So there is always a family at the center of whatever narrative context is going on in a dizzy. And the third characteristic is probably it's never overly sexual, and it's also never overly violent. So it might have really big and really violent sexual themes, like one example that's been very famous worldwide too is a dizzy called Fatma Gül'ün Suçu Ne, which is about a gang rape and what happens afterwards. But you never see the actual rape sexualized in a way that you would see it, let's say, in Game of Thrones. So yes, it might have sexual content or sexual themes, but you will never see an sort of visualization of it in an overly done sense. And the same goes for violence too. So you might have a disease that is, well, for the last few years, one subgenre that has been on the rise is these military disease, militaristic disease. So you might have guns and rifles and bombs and people killing each other, but you never really see an actual violent act depicted in a gory, in a very visual way. Again, this might also characterize a common theme of dizzy. Some of this is, of course, about the regulations of broadcast in Turkey. Some of those is just about the more inherent narrative characteristics of a dizzy. But if we were to sort of try to summarize the biggest 2 or 4 features of a dizzy, I guess that's what we would come with. So you would have something that is usually centered around family, that is usually really long, and that is never overly violent or overly sexual, even though it might be about violence or about sex. And even when I think about this, it really does sound a little bit like other television content that we have seen, like the British soaps or like the Mexican telenovelas, and which is fine, really, because while they're all different, you can really see this sort of what is common in most of them, like novelas, for example, also usually do have family at their center. Or soap operas, again, usually won't be overly violent in how they're doing this. But still, first, they're a little bit also different than themselves, but also talking about talking almost historically, they belong to almost different eras. Like we talk about, we can talk about this sort of the rise and real globalization of those soap operas, these dramas about during 80s, maybe, like a lot of non-US regions, a lot of people not living in the US probably remember Dallas from the 80s because that was just given to them. And then telenovelas, we could probably, when we think about, and we could probably think about 90s and beginning of 2000s. Like if there are any Turkish people in the audience, they will know the afternoon television telenovela shows in Turkey, like, you know, things like Rosalinda or Maria Mercedes. I don't know the original name, but there was something called the Winds of Lie. So you will know that telenovelas were quite popular globally then. And then with late 2000s and especially 2010s, I think we're beginning to see the same sort of trend towards Turkish TV. Because today, when we look at it, and people are usually surprised when they hear this at first, but Turkish television industry is the second most exported television industry in the world after US. So right after all the, you know, Hollywood dramas, it's the Turkish disease that get exported to all over the world, and especially Central and Latin America, uh, and Asia and Middle East, of course. So we do see a rise of it. And there are, of course, a couple of, not couple, several, many reasons that might really explain this, right? And there is a fascinating book by Fatima Bhutto about this, about the rise of Turkish disease, Korean K-pop, and one more thing that I can't remember, sorry about that, but about this new sort of almost indie-like forms of global popular culture. So there might be several reasons that can explain this, but I think, and I don't really want to dwell on these reasons because most of them I think we will be talking about soon anyway. But one thing that I really want to point out, because I think that's really ignored and overlooked a lot, is the impact of subtitles. So, you know, this year Parasite won the Academy Awards, and we were very, very excited. And there was I think there was a very pragmatic reason why this was possible this year and not any other year. Because with streaming television like Netflix and Amazon Prime and Hulu and all of that, we really did get a new habitual mode of viewing TV where even if we are native speakers, even if we do know language, we watch it with subtitles. Everyone really got used to subtitles. And it's not just something I'm saying. There, you can find a couple of articles about this online too, because just watch a talk of Reed Hastings, Netflix CEO, from a couple of years ago, when he says our competition is not HBO or this channel or this channel, but they say our actual competition is sleep. We just don't want you to sleep, but instead watch Netflix. And you do realize this. I'm sure there are many people here like me who have, like, you know, they have some shows and films on Netflix that they have to watch, particularly on like a weeknight or weekend night with their popcorn and drink and snacks. But then they also have those shows that just sort of stands on the background. Maybe it's the 12th rerun of Friends. Maybe it's Gilmore Girls because it's the best show ever. Or maybe it's just something, you know, really cheesy that you have on the background and you have the sort of the luxury to overlook, to ignore. And this new mode of engagement really got people used to the idea of subtitles and watching things with subtitles, so that they can multifunction, so that they can watch a second screen at the same time. And I think that is something that is really ignored when we look at the rise of Turkish TV, because obviously there was a huge language barrier, and we just said, like, these are, you know, 2-hour, 3-hour per episode content, so it's not very easy to dub them either. So if you were to, you know, make it into an English language, you would probably spend twice or 3 times the amount of time that you would spend for another show in order to just dub them. And I think that's something that's really important in explaining the rise of Turkish television. But in itself, of course, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. So it should probably be noted about this, you know, this habit of background TV and everything. And obviously there is a huge push. There has been a huge push from Ministry of Culture of Turkey and all the television agencies in Turkey representing these shows and trying to get them across the borders too. So I'm just going to sort of try to wrap this, as I said, longish introduction up. But so what does Netflix really stand in all of this? Like, we might understand that Turkish TV is on the rise, but what's going on with Netflix? Why are they really investing in it right now? More than some countries, still less than some other countries, and what does it mean for them? And one of the reasons for that is the idea of a back catalog, or the idea of a library. Because Netflix, sure, we all love Netflix originals, but even when they started, they were a DVD by mail company. And once they started streaming, they were actually just streaming their own DVD catalog. And they didn't really get to start originals until 2013, the beginning of 2013. So what that means is they always had, in their almost company DNA, they always had this idea of a library of televisual or filmic content. So what that means is when Netflix goes ahead and buys Resurrection Ertuğrul, this massive, epic Turkish historical drama that spans across 5 seasons, and it's at least 200 episodes long. Once they have it, it's just there. And once it's there, anyone can watch it while they're ironing something, or while they're doing their dishes, or while they're just really watching it. So I think that and that's what we call a televisual afterlife. So you're not really watching it while it is broadcast, but you are watching it because it's there afterwards. And a huge Turkish content library is there on Netflix. Some of the content there is actually original content that has been commissioned by and produced for local subscription video on demand services, but bought by Netflix for their global rights, and still promoted as Netflix originals, which in itself is a sort of a problematic term, but we can get into that later. So yeah, those are all Netflix originals, but for some reason they're also originals of someplace else. But because they get to spend this very active televisual afterlives in Netflix, they just really develop in their added value over time. And I guess my last point about Netflix on this is we should just remember that Netflix is always a company that really relies on big data. Like, if you're interested in any of these topics, you probably know the story behind House of Cards, the first ever produced by Netflix sort of original. And the reason it was able to come out from Netflix is because they looked at their data and they saw Kevin Spacey, who obviously we hate now. Kevin Spacey films were getting watched a lot. And then they looked at David Fincher, who was developing the series and was directing the pilot episode. And they saw that David Fincher films were also viewed a lot of times, and they just figured, oh wait, then yeah, this will work, because apparently everybody likes Kevin Spacey, everybody likes David Fincher, so they will probably like this too. And then it worked. So I think we can sort of apply that same principle to the Turkish series too. It would be quite naive to think that they don't really look at big data before they commission anything, or before they buy the licenses for something that has already been done. And I think the best example for this is the sort of the flagship of Turkish TV in the global network, the Magnificent Century, because, well, it's basically summarized as Sex and the City meets Game of Thrones. because that's literally what it is. It's like, 15th century Ottoman. You're in this huge palace. Everyone is gossiping, but also trying to kill each other. Also, everyone is trying to kill each other, but also gossiping about each other. And there is a lot of, sex and lies that's going on. So just looking at it like this, you're thinking, okay, Game of Thrones is something that's been watched by a lot of people. Sex and the City too. If we match this, yeah, this should actually work. And I mean, surprise, it does actually work. So to just sort of round this off, I have just made a note to myself that saying like, what is next? And the question of what is next is actually sort of, well, what was going to be next if coronavirus didn't happen? Because literally 4 days before the big, like before it was revealed to be a global pandemic, so just 4 days before the lockdown on UK happened and everything, Netflix Turkey announced that they were developing 6 new original shows simultaneously. Now, of course, one way to look at it is Netflix usually releases around 800 original shows in a year. So 6 is a really small, tiny number. But as I just said, 70-80% of these originals are just things that have been bought, licensed for global release. But these 6 shows that we're talking about, they are being produced and distributed by Netflix exclusively, which is really a big deal. Ask at any major Turkish production firm. None of them have 6 shows that they're producing in a year. Ask any studio, none of them are doing 6 shows simultaneously. And what is more, they're also starting to do a Netflix original films in Turkish, which is new. As you just said, the first one just came out, One Way Ticket to Tomorrow, I think it's called. I haven't watched it yet, but I'm quite excited about it too. So you see that they're really expanding their Turkish market, and you can really see that they're really investing a lot of money on this because, as I said, developing 6 shows together is a big deal. And these are the new shows. We still have the new seasons of The Gift and Love 101 that is about to come, that is going to come in the near future. And I think they just announced the release date of season 4, the final season of The Protector, the very first Turkish original to come out on July. So they were actually able to see their first project from the beginning to an end. So it has come to a full circle. So I do think that it at this point, it is really hard to ignore it now. I really wouldn't be surprised if we see a Netflix office in Turkey opening soon. But to go back to the question of what is next, the coronavirus situation really sort of blurs a lot of things. Like I'm in contact with the director of one of these simultaneous projects. I think it was called If Only. And they were actually about to go into production. The shooting was about to start in 2 weeks. And then the lockdown happened. And now they just sort of stopped everything. And they don't know when they will be starting back again. And Netflix also keeps saying that they do have a lot of content that they're going to release, and that this outbreak is not going to sort of impair their content release in any way. But I think it's just something that we're going to have to wait and see. But it is also a fact that during the outbreak, a lot of people are sort of playing into that nostalgia, to that Televisual Afterlife thing. Even the broadcast televisions in Turkey, they started re-airing their most famous, popular broadcast television. And I'm sure a lot of people online have also just restarted or started for the first time something that they haven't had time to watch in a long time. So it's a little bit vague what the future holds, but it's for sure that the Netflix investment in Turkish television is also expanding. And I for one, I'm very excited to see where it takes us to next.
Yeah, I think a lot of interesting things, will happen. And as you stressed, there's a lot of investment being made into Turkish dramas, and Netflix obviously is investing heavily to get ahead of its competitors. So you've raised a lot of really interesting questions, and we sort of have like two massive areas to cover. One is Netflix itself, and the other one is the Turkish disease. And I realized, obviously, I didn't introduce myself, so people also understand.
I didn't introduce you. That was horrible of me.
Don't worry. I will introduce myself. It's okay. Because I want people to understand also where I'm coming from in terms of asking some questions before we then open up to everyone's questions. So apologies, everyone. My name is Carla Figueira. I am a lecturer at Goldsmiths University of London, and that's kind of evident in my background. So, it's not totally like, who's that person? Where is she from? And there, I'm based at the Institute for Creative and Cultural Entrepreneurship. And I teach mostly in the area of international cultural relations. And one interesting note that is going to lead also some of my questions is I'm originally from Portugal. And in Portugal, where I did most of my growing up, I've only been living in the UK the last 15 years, television is not dubbed. We have subtitles. So we're very used to watching television in its original language. And when you raise the issue of subtitles, I think that's really interesting, because obviously here recently in the UK with the Danish dramas, Borgen and and all the subsequent series, there was this revelation. We can watch really interesting and engaging series not in English. So I thought that was a really interesting point. And so that's one of the things I think Netflix has kind of really done by opening up all these different possibilities. But I said, we have these two massive areas to cover. And I would like maybe to start by asking you, in terms of Netflix and their business model. So we are at this moment in a very complex television ecosystem. And Netflix, as you said, started as a on-demand business model and kind of grew massively now. But they are now not the only kids on the block. You have Disney Plus, Apple, HBO, NBC, Universal, or all these players also, trying to increase their back catalogs. And I was just kind of thinking, when I was preparing for moderating the talk today, do you think they are investing in the Turkish series as a way to be able to capture a more diverse audience, and specifically the markets that maybe their competitors are not covering? Like you mentioned, Middle East, Asia, Latin America, Africa?
Well, so the question of the competitors is really interesting for a couple of things, in a couple of ways, because of how Netflix positions themselves in that competition, and also how the other video on demand services position themselves there. So, for instance, Apple TV Plus and Disney Plus, they don't really how do I put this? They don't necessarily act like direct competition to Netflix, because they never really want to be all-encompassing like this. For Disney, for example, Disney Plus is just this hub, just like their Disney World or Disneyland parks, where people can access all of Disney content. And it's not really, for them, it's not really about localization or anything, but it's really about the Disney brand. For Apple TV Plus, their television content is much like how they look at their iPhone, or much like how they look at their software. What they are trying to do is to supposedly supposedly offer a sort of premium, Appleified, polished content. If anyone has watched the Apple originals like The Morning Show or See, they will know what I mean. Even the color, the lighting, the sort of the production quality of those shows feel like they were made for Apple. So in that sense, in terms of your question, I think the biggest competition for Netflix is Amazon Prime, because Prime Video is also trying to make sure that they have a library and a catalog that is as vast as possible. And they are really going head to head in terms of their Bollywood and Indian and Pakistani catalog too. But I would definitely say that Netflix seems to have a sort of headway towards not just Turkey, but also other local markets too, which is, again, a bit understandable because Prime Video is one aspect of this, Amazon behemoth, 7 layers of hell sort of corporation thing, whereas Netflix is just that. Netflix is Netflix. So that's literally all they do. So I guess that would be my answer to your question.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to add one thing to what you said about the subtitles, because I keep forgetting this whenever I talk. Of course, whenever I'm thinking like, oh, but people were used to doing this, blah, blah, blah. What I'm talking about is Anglo-Saxon and American television, or those audiences. Just like, I mean, Turkey is not really good with subtitles that much, but just like Portugal, a lot of Nordic countries usually don't do dubbing too. They use subtitles. So it's a very sort of British and American thing to ask, what is a subtitle? What do you mean I can't understand this? Sort of thing. But we really do see them coming a long way. Like last year's BBC show, Giri Haji, like nearly half of the TV show was in Japanese with English subtitles, and it was one of the biggest BBC shows of that year, and people just ate it up. So hopefully they're really coming somewhere with that.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So maybe now we can move a little bit more to Turkish centered topics around the DZ. Sure. And I can't avoid obviously a question about the soft power of the Turkish dramas, because you did mention, that the Ministry of Culture, kind of was also, to an extent supporting this. But I also believe in the past, there were some diseases that the government wasn't so much in agreement with. Mm-hmm. So if you could, maybe talk a little bit about, how do you see the disease being able to shape the perceptions of foreign publics about Turkey?
Well, I mean, obviously, this is, I think, one of the more central questions that we really should be exploring here. And I think that probably a better way to start this question is to talk about what we see on TV versus what we see in Turkey itself, and you do see a lot of differences. First of all, a lot of these diseases that are broadcast globally are centered in or around Istanbul. So you do see a lot of focus on the capital city. But they don't really necessarily represent all of Istanbul or all of Turkey in them. Again, as I referred to her, Fatima Bhutto talks about that in her book too. For instance, you see them more now, but you didn't used to so much. You don't really get to see a lot of women wearing headscarves or covered, or visually practicing their religion on TV on those shows. As I said, you do see them more now, but still they are very, very underrepresented versus what you would see on screen, on street. Sorry, this is one thing that Fatima Bhutto says too. She says like, oh, when I'm on the street, in 5 minutes, I will see a lot of these different representations of women. But on the TV, we don't really get to see that much. On TV, it's more about the secular woman. It's more about the woman with not wearing headscarves and everything. So I think that's one of the I think that might just be one of the biggest differences between the sort of Turkey versus the televised Turkey.
Yeah.
The second one I would say is the notion of the historicization process that we see on television, because a lot of people who would watch, Resurrection or Magnificent Century, you would assume that this is just so engraved into Turkish culture, and it is in some cities too. But then in the society itself, a lot of these parts of that history is just not known a lot by people. In fact, I think this is one of the sort of trivia information about Magnificent Century too. They worked with like various consultants to make sure that they got all the bits and pieces of that century right, because a lot of the public information knowledge about that was simply not very wasn't very material. So back to that half of your question about Dizzy as soft power. I know for a fact that it has been quite instrumental in terms of tourism, obviously, especially in Middle East. There have been specific tours where people would go and just watch these sets, or they would try and meet the fans, meet the actors and actresses, and vice versa too. So a lot of these sort of actors and actresses became Middle Eastern stars. They went to festivals and fairs and conventions in various Middle Eastern countries and were treated like the superstars that they were. I guess in terms of imagery, a lot of that soft power has definitely been in place for the last few years.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. I don't know if there's any statistics connecting, for example, obviously, because as you mentioned, a lot of these dizis are filmed, in old Istanbul. So if there's kind of like correlation really between even waves, of fans going and, to these locations, as you were mentioning, having specific tours going on, that's really interesting. Another interesting thing you mentioned in your initial talk when you were characterizing Dizzy as a genre was exactly the focus on traditional family values. So I wanted you to expand a little bit more on how that has been really a catch to popularize this series, in specific countries, in Latin America, in Middle East, in Asia, in relation, what differentiates it, from more Western series?
Well, my broader research is about analyzing the narrative structure in Netflix originals. So it's not even about the Turkish series, right? So I really try to think a lot about how people create these narrative structures and how they form these narratives. And something that I think is quite distinct between Turkish series versus, let's say, mainstream American series dramas is that usually if they're not like an ensemble sitcom like Modern Family or Friends or something, dramas usually focus on individual stories, and in a way they almost are quite lonely stories. So you have that main character, and sure, there are all the surrounding characters and all the settings and everything too, but you really follow that hero's journey and that journey only, without anything on the periphery. Whereas in Turkish dramas, you don't necessarily follow one protagonist. You have, you know, you have maybe 5 or 6 people who switch places between being the main characters and side characters, much like how would we be on soaps or telenovelas, but in a, you know, larger, grander scale. And what that means is after a while you become familiar and with and accustomed to not just one character but a set of characters, so you start finding yourself in it. um, if there are any Turkish people in the audience, they will, most of them, for example, will know this famous Turkish dizi Forbidden Love, Aşk-ı Memnu, which is centered around this big mansion where, you know, there is this big family with brothers and sisters, and then a bride comes as the new wife of someone old, and I don't know, his nephew also falls in love with her, something, whatever. But the point is, after watching that show for, I don't know, let's say 10 episodes, suddenly you know every single character in that mansion and all the, you know, characters of the family, but also the people, you know, like the maids and the drivers and the gardeners. And so from the 11th episode onwards, you are not emotionally invested in one character, you're emotionally invested in a network of relations between characters. And I think that sort of and while you are, you know, this much emotionally invested,
Yeah.
the content itself doesn't really want too much from you. You know, like if you miss something, it's probably going to be recapped a couple of times. If that character did something horrible, but I don't know, you went and you had to answer your phone, you know that, you know, other characters are going to be talking about it
Yeah.
again and again and again. So while it does give you that emotional investment, it doesn't really want your attention investment that much. So it sort of becomes this really good payoff. All it wants, what it wants you to invest is your time, but even then, it doesn't really want your time just to itself. So, you know, as long as it's open somewhere, as long as the commercials can play and someone can get money, it's fine. It's not like, you know, it's not like I keep giving the example of Game of Thrones for some reason, but let's say Game of Thrones or Lost, where, oh, I just missed this 30 seconds. So for the next 4 seasons, I'm not going to understand anything because that was just vital information. You don't have that. So I think that's just a massive appeal. And I can talk more about this, but
I just wanted to comment just very quickly. I just find it interesting that you know, you're saying in a way it is this immersive experience, as you were saying, but doesn't require you, you know, like an in-depth, you know, 100% attention for you to follow what is going on. And it's something where there's a little bit for everyone, you know, as you're saying, in having these multiple characters. And so you as a viewer will always have a situation, a character with whom to identify,
yes,
you know, and create that sort of emotional connection to. So I find this you know, quite interesting. And I'm obviously wary of the time because we have 1 hour for our webinar talk. And meanwhile, I've already asked people that if there are questions, please use the chat feature to ask questions. Questions on different social media will be summarized and transmitted to us. Meanwhile, I already have a question. So, Orçun, if you don't have any more to add at this moment, maybe we can move to some questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that last bit because I don't know why I forgot that. With the duration, the length, I said, you know, it all it wants is your investment in time, and I just like the it always surprises people when we talk about that too. But Steven Johnson has a great book called Everything Bad is Good for You, in which he argues that you know, there is this notion that we think people watch shorter things, people read shorter things, people every content is getting shorter and shorter, and he just says that he doesn't believe it, and I agree with him. He says that the average news article is longer now, the things we watch are longer, YouTube videos got longer, even the emails that we are writing on average got longer, and even in today's sort of media landscape we see that people watch Twitch streams for hours on end. You know, people when they watch shows, they usually binge them, so they watch them in 3 or 4 hour parts. So that really also became, I think, a very good plus, a positive for Turkish series, because they were already wrong. So if you were looking to binge something, well, what better to do than watch this thing where each episode is 3 hours and it goes on for like, you know, hundreds of episodes. So that was the last point I want to add. And yeah, if we can switch to questions, if there are any.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting point of kind of how our consumer behavior, you know, as viewers, has really changed over time, and it's interesting, you know, to kind of reflect on that. Another thing, it's come up here in a question. So Elizabeth Mitchell asks, are the new Turkish series similar to the Bollywood Indian films? I find this question interesting also in the sense that it indicates really how, in terms of the creative industries, we have industries developing all over the world. Nollywood, Bollywood, you know, the Turkish TV industry in all different countries. You know, as I mentioned to you, I was originally from Portugal, and I really grew up watching Brazilian soap operas, telenovelas.
Yeah.
So massive industry. So we have now a lot of competition to what we would say, oh, you know, the dominance of Hollywood in the globalization of culture content. So coming back from my, you know, deflection, personal deflection, to again to the to Elizabeth Mitchell's question about the similarity between Turkish series, Bollywood Indian films, and if you know, want to compare with other creative industries, industries in the area of film in other countries.
Well, that's an interesting question, because as I said at the beginning, in terms of exposure to global audiences, I think there are similarities, not just with Bollywood, but like you said, with telenovelas too, and with soap operas too, and in sort of, you know, in its timely manner, like this is the time for them to go global. But as industry practices, Turkish television industry is quite unique, because first of all, it is uh, it, it is in a much larger scale than the Turkish film industry. It drives so much more money than film industry too, to a point where it almost detriments film industry. You know, you will see sometimes actors or actresses not doing films because they won't have time or they won't have enough money compared to televisions. You will have films that are like spin-offs from television shows who are destroying box office and sort of almost devouring other maybe more indie films. So in itself, Turkish television industry is quite a unique structure, and because in Turkey you don't really have studios, film or television studios. You have production companies, and then you have the television networks, and then you have agencies that sort of are a middleman, not between network and the production company, but between whoever they're talking with and the global markets. So for me, it is sort of hard to make a comparison. I think there is some comparison to be made in terms of the content, like the sort of, these notions of love triangles, or never being able to reach your beloved on one side of the spectrum, and on the other side having those hyper militaristic, I'm going to kill all the bad guys because I'm a very nationalistic hero trope. So yeah, sure, there are similarities there in terms of content, but I couldn't dwell on them too much, honestly.
We do have here another interesting question.
Sure.
And I find it interesting also because it exemplifies here the diversity of strands that Turkish disease develop. So Murat asks, what is your take on Love 101?
Yeah. So for anyone who doesn't know, Love 101 is Netflix's third original Turkish series that it was released in early 2020 or very late early 2020, and is a sort of high school friends sort of drama that is set in 90s Turkey. And that is my take is centered on this key point, that it's set in the 90s. Because when I was talking about televisual afterlives in Netflix, when when Netflix is looking at shows or series or new developments, or commissioning old television shows, reruns of them or reunions of them or revival shows of them, they have to strike a balance between nostalgia and newness. And I think Love 101 is a really good example of that, because it is set in 1990s, but it doesn't necessarily have to be set there. So none of the elements of the narrative are directly related to the time frame, but it still gives you a slice of that nostalgia. And it is also peculiar in one more aspect. Because of its time frame, it shows you, especially because it's a high school drama, you assume that the target audience is young people. And for most young people, people under the age of 20 or something, it shows them a Turkey that they simply have never experienced. They did not know, they did not know, governments before this one. They did not know how daily life was back then. Even how high school functions is different. Like now they have a slightly different education system that is like 4 years, 4 years, 4 years, whereas back then it was different. So I think it's a very nostalgic experience for millennials. But also it's a very new and fresh and interesting experience for the next generation, to which I think really adds up to its appeal. I don't know how good it how well it was received worldwide, but I know that in Turkey it was received very, very very well.
And on that note of it was well received in Turkey, that connects perfectly with our next question from Umi. He asks, are these Netflix diseases as popular in Turkey as they are worldwide, and are they welcomed in non-secular households?
That's a very, very interesting question. I think for almost all of them, they are, yes, very popular in Turkey too. And then the perhaps the more interesting part of this answer is, they are quite welcomed in the so-called non-secular households in Turkey too. When we were talking about the televised Turkey not showing a lot of people with wearing headscarves and everything, but the actual Turkey having them. Fatima Bhutto talks about that too. You see, I don't know how to put this really. In more in more conservative households, I guess, even then, there is an understanding that that lifestyle does not make for intriguing, interesting drama. So they, so they very enjoy watching that watching that kind of life, um, because it is something of a fresh experience for them. And even more importantly than that, a lot of these dramas, which is almost like a subgenre in disease, they take place in very lavish, very rich, very wealthy households, with like this big families or big corporations there that are clashing together, or maybe the main character is poor, but their love interest is very rich. The same old Cinderella stories. And obviously, there are a lot of households that do not have that lavish lifestyle too. So that also becomes quite interesting and intriguing. But yeah, I can say with quite confidence that in Turkey, they're quite taken very very well as well.
Well, Umi says thank you. He's a Turkish from London, and he does not watch any disease.
You should watch some disease. Just go on Netflix and start Son, S-O-N. That's a good place to start.
Okay. I'm conscious we have, 4 minutes. So maybe I'll ask a final question using my prerogative as moderator.
Sure.
And, if we have time, we'll obviously pick up any more questions. I was really interested in the fact that obviously Turkey came in at a point where, in the past, other countries had also been successful. So Egyptians dominated cinema and television in the 90s. Of course, I mentioned already, and you mentioned Brazilian and Mexican telenovelas. And obviously, we have the very recent fact, for example, that Saudi Arabia removed the Turkish dramas from TV in Middle East, Northern Africa. Do you think that sort of blockade could have a negative impact in the continued expansion of Turkish television abroad, or are we continuing on a path of growth?
Is that your final question? Because that we need to talk about this for longer. Well, this is a very interesting question because um, it ties to a very significant debate that's been going on in television studies right now, which is where those public broadcasters and broadcasting regulators stand in this new landscape, in this new ecosystem. All over the world, public broadcasters and broadcast regulators are trying to understand and regulate streaming services and foreign television and everything. Just you gave the example of Saudi Arabia. A lot of people, I guess, will remember this. There is one episode of Hassan Minhaj's The Patriot Act show that is censored in Arabian Netflix that can't be reached from there because it is critical towards Saudi Arabia. So I would say that in with this momentum and with this stage of the world and with this stage of globalization that we have, I don't think that censorship or blockade never ever can truly work. And as time and time again we see, most of the time it actually just backfires. Whenever you say, oh, you can't watch this, people Google what is this. And now more than ever, whenever you Google something, it's very very easy to find even if you're somewhere where it's not geographically possible to find something, you can still find it by doing some magic. So no, I really don't think it will be an impediment towards towards television. What might be more of a uh, um, damage is the actual outbreak, I think, because all over the world there are now a lot of productions that are not running, but there are a lot of creators who are still creating and who are still pitching and who are still developing and who are still, you know, doing the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And once you have your, for the lack of a better word, A-list content creator giving you two content instead of one, and once you can go back to production on them, then suddenly you don't need that many filler content. And I'm not saying, of course, that Turkish TV is a filler content, but that's how you get new fans. You know, the new fan of Turkish disease is not going to come because of this new Turkish TV that's been amazing. They're going to come from watching and rewatching that shows. So I think that might be a little bit problematic. But even that, even then, it might not even be that much of a problem. So I don't think it should be that problematic. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carla.
We are at the end of our time. And before I kind of pass the word to you for your final words, I just want to reproduce here a comment from Hira that says she's very happy Netflix is giving alternative narratives to the mainstream. Alternatives to the mainstream Western narratives through Netflix. So thank you very much, everyone. I think it was a very productive conversation. And yeah, we probably have convinced a few people to try to watch some disease on Netflix or on YouTube. So for me, thank you very much. It was a pleasure moderating the conversation. And I give you the floor, Orçun, for the final words.
It was my pleasure. Honestly, thank you so much for the wonderful questions, Carla, and for wonderfully navigating this and navigating me around this. And thank you so much to Yunus Emre Institute too for facilitating this. You're doing an amazing job here in London too. And to everyone who watched this, I do hope you enjoyed it. Sure, this talk was about Turkish series, but also while you have Netflix, watch other stuff too, because there are a lot of content from a lot of parts of the world that are very, very different, and they each have their own, you know, unique, amazing appeal. You know, yeah, you were just talking about Brazilian series. Watch 3% on Netflix. That's amazing. You know, if you're into French shows, watch Marianne. That's amazing. If you're into Nordic TV, watch Ragnarok. That's amazing. But yeah, if you're into Turkish TVs, watch Son, because that's amazing too. So yeah, I guess that's my final babbling to finish this. Thank you everyone for watching.
Thank you everyone. Go and watch some television.
Yeah.
Being with us, and stay safe and stay healthy.
Exactly.
Until the next time. Bye bye everyone.
Bye everyone.